Listen closely to this, right now. It could be you, the one watching this video, who has once been forced to apologize just because you dared to question what made your heart uneasy. You know that feeling, don't you? Seeing a strange message, noticing an inexplicable coldness, asking a simple question, and suddenly finding yourself labeled the suspicious one, the controlling type, the annoying husband. In that very moment, you stop trusting your own intuition. You turn inward and start doubting yourself. Am I being too sensitive? And instead of getting the truth, you receive silence, blame, and eventually, you silence yourself. And that's why this video exists. Not to blame, not to encourage suspicion, but to help you face 5 extremely subtle psychological tactics some wives may use to hide infidelity, things never spoken outright, but silently leaving you confused, exhausted, and blaming yourself. This story isn't just a list. It's the journey of David, a 58-year-old man who once believed that love, if big enough, could keep everything intact. But he woke up and realized, not everything that looks like love is truly love. So before we begin, I want you to do something very small but enough to affirm that you've once known this feeling. Leave a comment right now. I once doubted my own feelings. Just one sentence, but it reminds you, a man's intuition is never wrong. It's only been silenced. Now, walk with me not just to hear a story, but to see clearly the signs that may be happening right next to you, yet hidden under the guise of perfect love. That night, David was sitting alone on the chair by the living room window. His wife's phone suddenly lit up, the screen reflecting a strange message around 11 p.m. It only flashed a name he had never heard before, accompanied by a smiley face emoji. It wasn't a big deal. At least, that's what David told himself. But inside, a very real discomfort began to rise. He looked up, trying to keep his voice gentle, and asked, "Who's texting you this late?" That was all the question was. But what David remembered most wasn't the question itself, but the reaction that followed. She paused for a second, looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears strangely fast, then said, "You always think the worst of me. After all these years, you still don't trust me." Her voice cracked, her shoulders trembled as if David had just said something terrible. In that moment, no one mentioned the message again. From a perfectly normal question, the story had shifted. David was no longer the one asking, he had become the one at fault. He remembered that feeling clearly, suffocating, awkward, and confused. Seeing the disappointed look in her eyes, watching her walk into the kitchen to wipe her tears, David instinctively stood up and tried to find words to apologize, even though he had done nothing wrong. And then, like many times afterward, he was the one who patted her shoulder to comfort her, promising to trust more, just to keep the peace in the house. But somewhere deep down, David knew he had already lost from the very first response. A loss that wasn't loud or dramatic, but enough to make him start doubting his own feelings. A loss that didn't make him angry, but made him withdraw, censor his next question, and remind himself, maybe I'm just overthinking. Guilt reversal. The turning of guilt wasn't something David ever thought would happen in his life. But that's what made it dangerous. It happened quietly, under the surface of seemingly harmless words. She didn't deny the message, didn't give any specific explanation. She simply struck a weakness that society had long taught David. A good man must trust his wife, no matter what makes him feel unsure. Trust was tied tightly to the definition of love. And David, like many other men, grew up believing that as an unspoken rule. But the problem is, unlimited trust becomes a blind spot, and someone who knows how to exploit it can turn every question into proof of a lack of love, turn every doubt into a moral failing of the man himself. That night, David apologized. But inside, the unease didn't go away. It was only pushed down, buried under a promise to stop overthinking. And like a repeating cycle, the questions became fewer. The moments he suppressed his doubts became more frequent, and little by little, David stopped trusting his own intuition. That's what guilt reversal is. It doesn't need outright accusations. It just needs to make you feel guilty for daring to ask. And once that succeeds, silence appears. And silence, over time, becomes fertile ground for hidden behaviors to grow. David no longer asked about the messages. He didn't ask about the late returns or the stories about friends he had never heard of before. Not because he didn't notice, But because he had been trained to believe that all doubt was wrong, that every internal warning was just insecurity, not a natural response to strange signs. And that's exactly how this tactic takes over the mind. From one seemingly small question, it flips the situation, forcing the man to apologize before getting a real answer. A subtle psychological battle, no yelling, no chaos, just a sad look and a single sentence enough to make the questioner confused. David learned that lesson. But perhaps the most important thing he wants to say to any man who has felt the same is this: if you find yourself apologizing for your own feelings, stop. Not because doubt is wrong, but because that might be the very moment you need to see things more clearly. And the most important question isn't, who was texting at 11 p.m., but why did asking that make me the one at fault? It was a Thursday evening that seemed ordinary. David came home after a long day, tired and drained like so many other days. But the first thing that made him pause was the strong smell of food filling the kitchen, the smell of a dinner he couldn't remember the last time had been prepared with such care. On the table was a full, elaborate menu: beef in red wine sauce, green salad with chestnuts, a fragrant apple tart, and red wine already poured into 2 old crystal glasses. She stepped out from the kitchen, wearing a dress David didn't think she still had, a gentle smile and warm eyes that made him more confused than touched. There was no special occasion, no anniversary, no explanation, just a soft sentence: "I want you to feel comfortable after a long day." David sat down at the table. Everything was too perfect, but it was that very perfection that left him unsure of where to begin. Because in all their years together, she had never given him an evening like this just for one reason: love. They had celebrated important occasions before, but there had never been this kind of unexpected tenderness, especially not lately, when things between them had been flat, sometimes even cold. And then it repeated. In the days that followed, she woke up earlier, made coffee exactly the way David liked it: strong, low sugar, no milk. She cleaned the house, which was usually messy, with an unusual level of care. She agreed with David in conversations that they would have certainly argued about before. She even started buying him small gifts she'd never paid attention to in the past: a dark blue shirt, a novel by a little-known author he loved. At first, David felt at ease. Who wouldn't want a marriage to suddenly become calm, gentle, and comforting? But the question that troubled him was, why? Why had everything changed so suddenly, almost overnight? After so many quiet and sometimes tense months, he began to notice the moments between those kind gestures. When she cooked, she would sometimes glance at her phone and smile, a strange smile that wasn't because of him. When she seemed to be listening to his stories, her eyes were distant and unfocused. David realized the perfection he was experiencing wasn't love suddenly blooming again after years. It was a facade, a way for her to cover something up underneath. There were no more heated debates about topics that once put them at odds, no more honesty that used to be at the core of their relationship. Everything was too smooth, too well-timed, too perfect, to the point where David began to feel like he was being lulled to sleep. The insight David gradually came to was this: sudden perfection is rarely the result of a genuine positive change. It's a reaction, a compensating effort driven by guilt the other person can't face directly. She wasn't changing because love had rekindled. She was trying to soothe her own remorse. And the most dangerous part of the perfect wife performance lies in this: it makes the man stop asking questions. When a marriage suddenly becomes pleasant, men tend to believe things are finally going well, even when their intuition tells them something isn't real. David had that exact experience, a moment of initial relief that slowly turned into a quiet doubt he didn't even dare admit to himself. The warm dinners, the surprise gifts, the easy agreements, they all made him forget one crucial truth. Real change in a marriage doesn't come overnight. It comes from difficult conversations, from walking through conflict together, from slow and sincere rebuilding. When David realized that, everything became painfully clear, and he remembered, with a sharp mix of pain and clarity, during the time she treated him most perfectly, the distance between them was at its greatest. The perfect wife performance love on the outside, but performance within isn't something easy to recognize right away. It's carefully constructed to soothe a suspicious heart, to cover guilt, and to make a man like David let go of the very questions that should have been asked from the beginning. David still remembered that Saturday night clearly, When she said she was going to her regular book club meeting with her close friends, before walking out the door, she fixed her makeup more carefully than usual, sprayed on a perfume she normally saved for formal occasions, then smiled. "I'll be home a little late. We have a lot to talk about with this book." David didn't suspect anything, at least not at first. He wanted to believe she was simply seeking joy, some relaxation after everyday stress. But over time, those book club nights became more frequent, later, and stranger. Once, David casually asked, "What book are you reading today?" She smiled, a slightly awkward smile. "Oh, just some old ones. Mostly just catching up with the girls." David started noticing things. During those long book club evenings, she never brought a book with her, or came home with one. Her friends, whom he'd met a few times during social events, never seemed to talk about books when they gathered. Once he accidentally overheard a phone conversation from the kitchen. Giggling, whispered warnings when someone's name was mentioned. Then David's questions quickly fell into silence. When he brought up the book again, she changed the subject, even lightly scolding. "You're always suspicious. Can't you just let me have a little personal space?" In that moment, David understood something deeper. It wasn't just that she was avoiding the question. The circle of friends around her was reinforcing the story. Friends who had been through divorces, who had their own private secrets, had now become a protective ring. They weren't just friends, they were allies. David was no longer facing one woman, but an entire network of stories, cleverly coordinated to protect what she didn't want to reveal. Book club was no longer a place for reading. It was a facade, a socially acceptable alibi so well constructed that anyone on the outside would look in and say, "It's just a healthy gathering of female friends." What weighed on David the most was the feeling of being surrounded. If he expressed doubt, he would immediately be seen as selfish, trying to control his wife's freedom. If he questioned any of those friends, they would all confirm the pre-written narrative. He was alone not just in front of her, but in front of a community that supported this freedom. But it didn't stop there. One evening, David noticed her phone placed face down on the table, something she rarely used to do. When a notification came in, she quickly pulled the phone close, locked the screen, and tucked it into her pocket. In the following days, he saw her taking the phone even into the bathroom, or waking up in the middle of the night to check messages in the dim light. Each time David gently asked, "Is something going on?" she would smile faintly. "Just work stuff, don't worry." Then he discovered the phone had a new passcode. New, unfamiliar apps appeared on the screen, a messaging app David had never seen before, hidden in a folder labeled Work. Even the way she held her phone changed, covering the screen, keeping it out of his line of sight. A clear insight gradually took shape in David's mind. Privacy and secrecy are not the same. Privacy is healthy and necessary, but secrecy often signals something being deliberately hidden. And what he was witnessing clearly wasn't privacy, it was secrecy, carefully orchestrated, deliberate, and reinforced by a circle of people outside their marriage. That realization silenced David again and again. Every outward act of care now felt like a quiet scratch inside his heart. Because it wasn't just a wife hiding something, it was an entire system, from friends to technology, forming a perfect armor to protect something he was left only to suspect. And the most terrifying part wasn't that he didn't have the answers, it was that he no longer had the right to ask. From now on, every question would be labeled as controlling, disrespectful of personal freedom, or blinded by jealousy. Gaslighting at this level wasn't just a one-on-one manipulation, it was the result of collective reinforcement, a gaslighting community, leaving David increasingly isolated in his own home. He realized that even if he kept asking, any explanation from now on would no longer hold real value. Because what he needed wasn't just words, it was the feeling of safety in their presence, the sense of respect through natural transparency. When he looked back at all those small details, the book club that never read books, the phone turned face down, the changed passcode, the strange apps, David knew he was no longer the man sharing a home. He was merely a guest being allowed to stay as long as he didn't ask the questions everyone already had rehearsed answers to avoid. And that was when David understood. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the betrayal itself, it's the sophisticated web of lies surrounding it. A web disguised as personal freedom or legitimate privacy, but in truth, just a carefully spun veil meant to make a man forget his right to know the truth. David remembered that night vividly, just the two of them in the room and an unfinished dinner on the table. No loud argument, No clattering of dishes, only that sentence from her, soft and low, yet sharp enough to carve a deep hole into his memory. "You never really understood me." It sounded like a sigh, but it carried the weight of an indictment against their 15-year marriage. David was stunned. Images immediately rushed through his mind. The vacations they'd taken together, the cold nights when she lay curled up in his arms, the stories they shared after work, even the time he left work halfway through, just to take her to the doctor when she had the flu. How could all of that become not understanding? David had always believed that their love was proof of his effort to listen, to be present, to be patient and kind. But in just one sentence, she erased it all. "You never really understood me." It wasn't just a complaint, it was her way of rewriting the past. The happy years, the memories he thought were the foundation of their marriage, were now being rearranged into a sequence of mistakes, shortcomings, distance, and miscommunication. David realized he wasn't only facing a change in the present, their history itself was being edited. From that point on, every memory that once warmed him became a weapon used against him. A joyful party where she once laughed loudly was now brought up as, "I was only pretending to be okay." Their deep conversations were reframed as, "I never felt heard." Even the sweet anniversaries, the ones he had felt proud of for making her happy, were now referenced as moments where she acted fine, so I wouldn't feel bad. David began to understand something even more painful than betrayal. It was when the person you once loved turns your most beautiful shared memories into justification for their betrayal. Psychological rewriting. Rewriting the shared story to favor the one who lied is one of the most dangerous ways to erase responsibility. When every part of the past is redefined, a man like David gradually loses the last thing he had left, his own memory. Every time David recalled a beautiful moment, she would paint over it with a different hue. Even when he said, "I remember that rainy night when you cried because you were touched. I walked through the rain just to get you flowers," she would sigh and say, "You don't get it. That night I cried because I felt lonely, not because of the flowers." Each story, each memory David had cherished as a part of his heart, was now being dismantled and reconstructed. And all of it led to a single conclusion, that she had a reason to feel misunderstood, and therefore she was justified in seeking empathy somewhere else. The cruelest part was how this rewriting made David unsure of what was even true anymore. He began to wonder, did I really neglect her? Was I emotionally absent and didn't realize it? That self-doubt simmered beneath the surface, slowly eroding his ability to discern reality. And that, in truth, was the silent purpose of narrative rewriting. Not only does it help the betrayer rationalize their actions to themselves, it causes the betrayed to question their own memory, their own truth. David slowly came to see that rewriting doesn't start from a single evening, or one conversation, or one event. It is a series of quiet reminders, small altered details repeated just enough times that the new story gradually replaces the real memory. In the end, David didn't just lose trust in her. He lost trust in his own emotions, his intuition, his memory. And when that happened, he understood what had been taken from him wasn't just the present or the future, but also the past. The years he once cherished had now been bent into a chain of mistakes that belonged only to him. The final insight David kept to himself was this: when someone begins turning a shared history into their own version of the story, it's not just a sign of betrayal. It's a sign they are willing to sacrifice everything, even memories and truth, to protect their excuse. And the sadder truth is this: rewriting history isn't just meant to cover up current betrayal. It prepares the mind for a future in which the betrayer can leave without guilt, because in the new story they tell themselves they were never happy, never understood, never truly belonged in the first place. For David, that was the final bell. He knew he couldn't reclaim a past that had been rewritten, but at the very least, he could protect his clarity in the present. And to do that, he began to accept a bitter truth. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is hold on to your own memory and never again let anyone twist it. David sat quietly on the old chair by the window, looking out at the silent autumn garden. The leaves rustled gently in the evening breeze, but his mind was still. This wasn't the first time he had sat alone like this, but this time was different. Inside him, there were no more lingering questions, no more simmering anger, and no more hope for any kind of explanation. What he had now was a single, absolute clarity. He had walked through it all: doubt, self-blame, trying to understand, enduring, forgiving, and finally realized he had been standing alone the entire way. This 58-year-old man was not cold. He had given emotion, had listened patiently, had believed that if he loved enough, everything would be okay. But the bitter experiences had taught him the price of placing trust in the wrong hands. A mature man doesn't grow cold because he has no more love to give. He grows cold because he has come to understand too well what happens when trust is given blindly. David understood that sometimes people don't betray because they weren't loved enough, but because they didn't have the courage to live honestly. And for that very reason, men like him are forced to learn how to withdraw, not to punish the world, but to protect themselves. Silence was no longer avoidance. It had become shelter, a space in which he could breathe deeply without fear of being misunderstood, without fear of rewritten stories, without fear of explanations carefully crafted to numb the unease inside him. That coldness on the surface, it was just a shell. Inside, David still felt everything, but this time he kept those feelings for himself. He no longer needed someone else to validate his worth, no longer sought comfort in someone's gaze, no longer wanted to hear the words, "Don't worry," just to soothe an intuition screaming inside him. He had passed that stage. He had grown tired of constantly questioning his own feelings just to keep a peaceful facade. Now, what he valued most was clarity. Clarity that needed no confrontation, no more answers. Just silence, a clear view of reality, and the courage to move forward. It wasn't coldness, it was awakening. So if you are hearing this story, if you've ever lived in silence, not because you felt nothing, but because you felt too much, and eventually had to teach yourself to be silent to protect your own peace, then you are not alone. Your silence is not loneliness. It is proof of growth, the result of a journey through things others only see on the surface. But inside you, every detail, every emotion remains fully intact. And if you've ever gone through that state of feeling, of doubting, and finally of clarity, then leave a message right now. I'm not cold, I'm just more awake. This is not a weak confession. This is the voice of a man who knows exactly what is worth holding on to and what must be let go. A man who has learned that not everyone deserves his understanding, and that sometimes peace is not something to be negotiated. It's the only thing left that must be protected. David stepped out of that darkness, not because someone else gave him the answers, but because he finally had the courage to trust his own feelings. And that is how a grown man reclaims his freedom, not loudly, not angrily, but simply by becoming more awake.